the 8th of June, year 1943. The waters of Hiroshima Bay were calm, eerily calm. Anchored in this quiet inlet was one of the most powerful symbols of Japan's naval might, the Battleship Mutsu. She wasn't on the front lines. There were no enemy planes, no submarines, no gunfire, and yet, at precisely 12:13 p.m., she exploded. Without warning, a thunderous roar shattered the bay. A massive column of fire and smoke shot into the sky, followed by a shockwave so violent it rattled ships miles away. The 39,000-ton behemoth, once the pride of the fleet, was torn in half. Within minutes, most of her crew was gone, 1,121 lives erased in an instant. There were no bombers, no torpedoes, no enemy sightings, no warning. The explosion came from inside the ship, and the question that haunted the Imperial Navy, and still echoes today, was simple. Why? What could destroy a fortress of steel in a peaceful harbor? Was it sabotage, a munitions failure, a terrible accident, or something far darker? To understand the mystery, you must understand the ship, her legend, her silence, and the horrifying moment she was consumed by the very power she was built to wield. It began as an ordinary day. A light breeze skimmed across the bay. On the decks of Mutsu, sailors carried out routine drills. Supply lines stretched to a nearby tanker. Young cadets toured the vessel in awe, walking beneath towering gun turrets, marveling at the steel giant beneath their feet. The scene was calm, almost peaceful, and then everything changed. At 12:13 p.m., an explosion erupted from deep within the battleship near her number 3 turret with the force of a volcanic eruption. A reddish-brown fireball punched into the sky. The shockwave rolled outward, slamming into nearby ships like a hammer. From a distance, it looked as though the sea itself had detonated. Within seconds, Mutsu's forward section, nearly 500 feet of reinforced steel, broke apart. It rolled to starboard and plunged beneath the surface. Hundreds of sailors and young naval cadets vanished with it, dragged down by the sheer weight of the collapsing war machine. There was no time to sound an alarm. No lifeboats. No last orders. Just a roaring, chaotic silence. The ship didn't just sink, it split in half. The stern, still afloat for now, sat eerily upright, a mangled tombstone. Crews from the battleship Fuso and other nearby vessels scrambled to the wreck, pulling stunned, oil-slicked survivors from the water. But it was hopeless. Out of 1,474 people on board, only 353 survived. Of 153 cadets and instructors, only 13 lived to tell the tale. The bay, once serene, became a graveyard. Smoke hung in the air. The water churned with debris, bodies, and disbelief. The enemy hadn't fired a shot. Mutsu had died without a battle. And as the survivors looked around, the true horror began to set in. This wasn't war. This was a nightmare no one could explain. To understand the tragedy of Mutsu, you have to understand what she meant to Japan. She wasn't just a warship, she was a symbol, a product of ambition, pride, and a desperate national desire to be seen as a global power. Born in the aftermath of World War I, Mutsu was Japan's thunderous answer to the Western naval giants. Laid down in 1918, she was armed with 8 massive 16.1-inch guns, the largest afloat at the time. She and her sister ship Nagato made headlines around the world. They were more than ships. They were statements. Japan had arrived. But just as she was nearing completion, her fate was nearly reversed, not by war, but by diplomacy. In 1921, the Washington Naval Conference sought to end the naval arms race by limiting battleship construction. Mutsu, not yet commissioned, was on the chopping block. Her cancellation would have been a humiliation, not just for the Navy, but for the nation. Funding had come partly from the public. School children had donated their pocket money. She was the people's ship. Japan's delegation fought hard. In a last-minute compromise, Mutsu was spared in exchange for scrapping an older vessel instead. She became the unkillable ship, a survivor of paper treaties and political battles, and that gave her an almost mythical status. Over the next 2 decades, she was repeatedly modernized. New engines, added armor, a towering pagoda mast, bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Every bolt, every upgrade was done with one goal in mind: to ready her for the decisive battle Japan believed was coming. She was a queen on the board not yet played, but always watching. And perhaps that's why her sudden, unexplained destruction decades later felt less like a casualty of war and more like a betrayal of destiny. When World War II erupted, Mutsu was ready, but the war had changed. The battleship, once considered the ultimate weapon, was now overshadowed by a new predator, the aircraft carrier. While carriers projected force across oceans, Mutsu, like many of her kind, was sidelined. She wasn't obsolete, but she was no longer center stage. At Pearl Harbor, she sailed as part of the main fleet, but she never fired a shot. She was kept far from the action, held in reserve for a battle that never came. Japan's naval doctrine was built on a single sacred idea, Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. It envisioned a massive clash where giants like Mutsu would crush the enemy in a final, glorious showdown. But the war refused to play by those rules. Time and again, Mutsu was withheld from combat. While carriers fought and died, she towed target ships, ferried fuel, and trained cadets. Once, during the Guadalcanal campaign, she spotted a lone American reconnaissance plane, and for the only time in her career, fired her main guns in anger. 4 massive shells flew skyward. The plane escaped untouched. That was it, her one moment of combat. By 1943, Mutsu was a relic in a war she'd been built to dominate. Too slow, too valuable, and ultimately too irrelevant. She was used as a floating fuel depot, giving her own reserves to smaller ships. A titan of steel, reduced to support duty. Her crew, trained for glory, instead endured silence and routine. And so the ship that had survived treaties and symbolized power spent her final months not in battle, but waiting, anchored in the quiet waters of Japan's inland sea, waiting for a role she would never play, and for an end no one saw coming. The explosion that destroyed Mutsu didn't just sink a ship, it shattered trust. Within hours, the Imperial Navy launched an urgent investigation. The initial theory was simple and comforting. Enemy action. A submarine, perhaps. Or a mine. Something external. Patrol boats swarmed the bay. Depth charges were dropped. Planes scanned the skies. But there was nothing. No enemy contacts, no traces of intrusion. The truth was undeniable and terrifying. The explosion had come from inside the ship. On the 11th of June, just 3 days after the disaster, a formal commission was convened. It was led by Admiral Koichi Shiozawa and tasked with answering one impossible question: what happened? Theories spread like wildfire. Was it a mechanical fault, a munitions accident, or something more sinister? One early suspect was the Sanshikidan anti-aircraft shells, special incendiary rounds stored near the blast site. Similar munitions had caused a fire at the Sagami arsenal months earlier, but extensive tests couldn't replicate the explosion. The theory quietly faded. Attention shifted to a more human cause: sabotage. Investigators fixated on one petty officer assigned to turret number 3. He'd recently been accused of theft and was reportedly despondent. Rumors swirled. Had he taken revenge in the most horrific way possible? It was a tidy explanation, convenient, self-contained, and tragically unprovable. The man was dead. No note was ever found. No evidence recovered. Still, on the 25th of June, the commission concluded the disaster was most likely the result of his deliberate actions. Case closed. But for many in the Navy, and for historians decades later, the verdict felt hollow. Could one man, acting alone, truly have accessed a magazine and ignited the explosives undetected? Or was it something the Navy couldn't afford to admit? Unstable cordite, systemic flaws, or mishandled safety protocols? One thing was clear: the truth, whatever it was, had become a liability. Survivors weren't honored. They were scattered to distant outposts: Guam, Truk, Saipan, where their voices were lost to war. The Mutsu investigation ended not with answers, but with silence. her wreck remained untouched, her story officially sealed, guarded not by sailors, but by shame. For decades, the wreck of Mutsu lay silent beneath the waters of Hiroshima Bay, broken, buried, and largely forgotten. It wasn't until after the war, when Japan began piecing together the fragments of its history, that the story resurfaced. Salvage operations began in the 1972nd, driven by both economic need and a desire to recover what remained of the ship and her crew. Piece by piece, Mutsu was brought back into the light. Her rusted turrets, her propellers, her mighty guns, ghostly artifacts pulled from the deep, not just steel, but memory. During the process, the remains of over 800 crew members were recovered. Men who had once been erased by secrecy were finally given the recognition of proper funerals. Today, a memorial stands in Soimura, facing the waters where she sank. One of her giant guns rests there too, silent and still a permanent monument to the tragedy and the unanswered questions that still echo. The official story remains unchanged. Sabotage by a single sailor. But among historians, naval engineers, and even surviving family members, doubt lingers. Could a lone saboteur really detonate a battleship's magazine? Was the real cause a technical fault, an unstable shell, an unnoticed spark that no one wanted to take responsibility for? Or was it something deeper, a reflection of the chaos, desperation, and fear gripping Japan in 1943? The truth may never surface. The evidence is scattered. The men who knew the most are long gone. But Mutsu's story is more than just a mystery. It's a mirror reflecting how nations deal with failure, how powerful institutions respond when something unexplainable happens on their watch, and how truth can be buried not just under water, but under pride. Her end wasn't a blaze of glory against a fleet of enemies. It was sudden, silent, and internal, an implosion that consumed her without warning. A battleship built for decisive battle, denied combat, and ultimately destroyed by something she could neither see nor fight. That's the tragedy of Mutsu. She was saved from the diplomat's pen, preserved through peacetime politics, upgraded for a war she never truly entered, and in the end, she died not as a warrior, but as a warning, a reminder that even the mightiest machines can fall not from without, but from within. And that sometimes the loudest questions come from the deepest silence.